Hello, welcome back. Um, so today I want to talk a little bit about the history of Richard Stallman and GNU and Linus Torvalds and Linux and another operating system called Unix that you may or may not think of when you hear the term Linux. That was written before Linux and GNU and actually has nothing to do, primarily has nothing to do with the two, at least in today's world. Alright, sorry about that cut there, but I wanted to pull up some pictures for y'all so that you could see who I was talking about and kind of picture what I'm talking about as I talk about it. So to begin with, we should start with GNU before we start about Linux, but we can't talk about the GNU before talking about Unix. So Unix was created, written by Bell Labs employees named Dennis Ritchie and Ken Thompson. So here's a picture of them. See if we can make it a little bit bigger. So here's a picture of them posing for a picture as they write. And as you can see, it's the big computer that fills up half the room and the big typewriters that they're kind of difficult to work with compared to today's technology. But so basically they wrote an operating system called Unix back in the 1970s for a company called Bell Labs. Well, Bell Labs was partially owned by AT&T, the phone company. At the time, Bell Labs was AT&T's computer division. So AT&T was involved with computing and computers and the server space back in the day, and Bell Labs was that part of the company for them. So these two men wrote an operating system called Unix for internal use by Bell Labs and AT&T. Well, okay, so they write the operating system. There's a little bit more to how it started. But what's important for us to know for this story is that AT&T decided that they were going to license Unix out to third-party companies or individuals who basically whoever wanted to buy the rights to have a copy of it. Well, the University of California at Berkeley licensed the software and got access to the source code, where they created another operating system called BSD. And that is essentially Unix as well. It's the same operating system. Both binaries will work with each other. But that was kind of a different distribution, similar to the idea of a distribution that we have today of Linux, but from Unix era. So that was the first open sourceness of kind of this whole GNU thing. That's where GNU got its source code from. And that's important to remember. Now the next thing that's important to talk about how Linux desktop became what it is today is a man named Richard Stallman. Now, if you look at this image, this is an image of Richard Stallman making a speech, apparently. But this gentleman was a student at MIT in the 80s, specifically 1980. And him, along with some other fellow students, were working in a lab, a computer lab, at the college. I'm going to tell you the tipping point for him. So just know that he was part of a hacker community at the time, and at the time the hacker community he was part of was beginning to splinter. At the time, the hacker community was beginning to splinter because of source codes getting out to the public and other companies reproducing their products. Companies, therefore, were making less money off of the products that they produced. So they started to make things closed source. Richard Stallman had a problem with that and started to say, you know what, no, this is not okay. Things should be open source. We need to be able to get to the source code of our software that we are using so that we can modify it and use it in manners that sort our uses. Well, a tipping point for him was when he was in the laboratory and they had a new printer. The previous printer had an open source software to it where he had created a feature in this software in which that if anybody was using the printer, it would notify every other user as well as the person when it was done printing. And if it had a jam, it would let everybody know that as well. This new printer had a closed source system, so he could not create such modifications to the new printer. This was an issue because of the fact that not everybody was on the same floor, so you would have to walk up and down stairs in order to get to the printer, and now somebody's using the printer and you have to walk back upstairs to your computer. Because if you think about it, they didn't have the luxury of a portable laptop in the way that we think of it today. There was desktops, and in most cases there was big massive machines like we had saw there. So it was just not as convenient as it is today, especially for printers. So this pushed him over the edge, and he decided that he was going to do something about it. What did he do about it? He started an organization and began writing an operating system called GNU. This is where people think that Linux is Unix-based, where it's not. GNU, which is a part of Linux desktop, but not a part of Linux itself, is a clone of Unix. So GNU stands for, literally GNU's not Unix, so that's a recursive acronym there because everybody thinks those are funny. But, so that's where GNU kind of plays into this whole story. Alright, that was done in the 80s, like I had said. Unix was written in the 70s, so there's one more part to the story. But before I get there, I want to tell you where GNU was as an organization and as an operating system when Linus Torvalds came onto the scene. So GNU had pretty much written an entire operating system. They had everything that they needed from a graphical user interface down to the operating system layer itself. They had everything except for one core piece of software that communicated directly with the hardware called the kernel. Well, turns out this guy, a man named Linus Torvalds, or Linus Torvalds, a Finnish student who was studying computer science at the time, wanted to, this was in 1991 by the way, wanted to use this brand new processor that supported the bleeding edge 32-bit processors when the latest operating system that he could get his hands on easily was only 16-bit. They had not caught up with the hardware yet. So for his own personal use, he decided that he was going to write a kernel called Linux. So what's kind of ironic about this is he used, well, this isn't the ironic part, but he did use another operating system called Minix at the time, and it was sort of based off that in a way, but that's what Linux was built on. So he used Minix to write Linux, and he used the GNU compiler to compile it. Yes, the same GNU from Richard Stallman. So he wrote this software, he wrote this operating system, or kernel really, so that he could use this new hardware. It was built out of a necessity. And even into this day, every time pretty much he added something to Linux, it was because of personal need. It wasn't because of, oh, this guy wants it or that guy wants it. It was because it made his life easier. So he ported Bash to it, and he ported GCC, like I had said, the GNU compiler, over to it as well. And that was kind of the humble beginnings of Linux. He created a post on an online forum pretty much stating that this was a personal project of his. It had been into working since April, and it wasn't going to be big or fancy like GNU is, and he actually name-dropped GNU in the post, and he had stated that, it was written in C, and kind of the basics about his software, and he had said, if anybody wants a copy of it, I'll be willing to share it with you. If you want other features, let me know. I might put them in there. And that was a bit of paraphrasing there, but that was pretty much what his post said. Well, in 1992, Linux really began to take off because Richard Stallman, like I'd said, needed a kernel, which was ironic because Linus Torvalds had written just that. So you can put two and two together. There was a bit of disagreements there at the beginning, but in the end, Linus Torvalds decided to license Linux under the GNU public license, henceforth making it free and open source for anybody and everybody to use for personal or public use. And that is sort of how GNU plus Linux / Linux came to be, and that is also why you hear a lot of Linux veterans calling it GNU plus Linux. Credit where credit is due, and if it wasn't for Richard Stallman, then Linux probably wouldn't have never taken off the way it did. It would have still been created because he didn't have anything to do with GNU, but that's how that got started. Kind of a humble beginning from a man stating that it was a personal project to now his software running almost every computer on the planet. And if it wasn't because of AT&T creating Unix way back in the 1970s, none of this would have ever really happened, probably. So I just kind of really like that backstory. It's a really cool backstory when you really get to understand it. And like I had said, he used Minix, so there's even another branch that we didn't go into in this video. But the backstories on this are it's a really neat backstory. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it was informational to you, and have a good morning, good afternoon, good night, whatever time it is where you're watching. And thank you for watching. Peace out.